Sin is single-handedly the reason for all of the problems in the world. It is also the number one thing we hear about when we go to church. There is more speaking being done about sin than there is preaching being done about the gospel. So that's really what I want to talk about today in this video. What exactly is sin and how does it impact people? I mean, what better way to live than like royalty? Again, the things we see happening in the world around us is a direct result of sin. So, what is sin? I know many people like to believe it as just doing what is believed to be wrong. And I mean, okay, if that's how you want to define it, but to really understand what it is, you have to understand how God defines it. So how does God define sin? And in order to understand that, we have to read it in its context through how he used it in the Bible. And we know the Bible has been translated from Hebrew and Greek and all of that. So we really need to look at the definitions in those languages. So I've looked it up and found a couple definitions that I want us to examine today so that we can really understand what sin is. But before I share any of these, let me just say that this word is loaded. And the fact that it's just being thrown around the way that it is to make people feel a certain way, make people do certain things, just goes to show how far off we've gotten with so many of these religious practices that are not in line with God's will. Again, what does God say about it? And that's what we're going to focus on today. So with that, let's get started. Now, I've looked these up in my Bible dictionary, my Vines, and found some of them. Like I said, I looked in the Hebrew and I looked in the Greek, so I'm going to give you some definitions for both. But the first one I want to start with is the Hebrew, and to start it off, I got some words that are somewhat synonymous with what sin is looked at as or defined as, and they are as follows. So you have iniquity, you have vanity, you have sorrow, you have wrongdoing, guilt, offenses, you have burden, work, trespasses, and then some others. But trying to put these into one singular sentence is kind of difficult. Like I said, the word is loaded and it's thrown around a lot, but I'm going to try my best to put it in form 2 or 3 things that I think, really speaks to what sin is in the context of what we always hear it as. And the first is trouble or difficulty caused by evil or wrong actions or words. So again, it is something that you endure because of something you did or said outside of God's will. And the second definition that I was able to conjure up, which is the absence of true worth or moral worthlessness. And that right there is loaded to me. And we, again, think about who the ultimate standard is. And if God is the standard and you have moral worthlessness, that means you have no godly standards within you. So you're just living in sin. Again, it's a lot to try and unpack, but the absence of true worth, that's the absence of true God. So that's the Old Testament, that's the Hebrew. Now, when I looked it up in the New Testament and found some of the definitions in Greek, it was simply put as this: to miss the mark, or it is an act of disobedience, or to act in error of the will of God. So again, looking at God as that standard, and then seeing anything that doesn't reach that standard, not being in line with God's will, not being right and being wrong, which is sin. Now, again, loaded, right? How can anybody be God? How can anybody live up to God's standard? It is possible. And that's something that we'll talk about further down. But just thinking about these definitions in general, making sure that the standard for the definition is set on God and not set on man. So when we talk about religious practices, when we talk about what people say you can or can't do as it relates to sin, sometimes none of what they're saying is in line with God. And I'm going to actually save that for the next video to talk about what sin is and what sin isn't, and how people are coming up with these different things to make you feel a certain way or to act a certain way because you're a part of their congregation and this, that, and the other. So we'll get into that. But for these purposes, sin, I mean, the best way to think about it is to really understand sin simply as an attitude, a thought, or action that is contrary to God's will and God's way of doing things, right? What is God's standard? And am I living in accordance to that, or am I in error of that? It's the best way to recognize whether or not you're living in sin in the most basic terms, right? Which is why it refers to missing a mark. A mark isn't subjective. A mark is the standard. And anything that's against the standard or not in line with the standard is wrong. And it sounds harsh, but it's really easy to keep that standard when you really look into everything God has provided us and given us to be able to live free from sin. And I'm not going to really go into it because, like I said, these definitions are dense and deep. But considering these are the definitions of sin, I just want to discuss, how people sin. So how do you commit sin? And then what is the impact of that sin? And how does you committing that sin affect you? But I'm not really going to get into it in this video. I'm going to do that in the next video. So this is going to be a two-parter. But again, I just really wanted to define sin because we hear it thrown around. It's used as a way to condemn people, to make people feel like they, going to hell, to make people feel like they're not welcomed or that they're not worthy of God or God's love. And that's a shame because the whole reason for Jesus coming was to die for the sins of the world. So we just got to get out of this mindset that there's a division. And we know that those divisions come to separate us, but we're stronger together. God wishes that we were all on one accord. We're one body. And the more we let sin separate, or how we see sin, define sin, and think about it, separate us from truly experiencing God's will for our life, the more we'll be left behind and left to the impacts of sin, which is, again, what we're going to talk about in the next video. But I hope that helps. So I broke it down in the Greek and the Hebrew. Again, this is how I define, or this is how I interpret all of these definitions and everything that I found when I looked up this. It's like 2-3 pages of definitions of sin when you look in the Vines. And that's just Old Testament. So that's just in the Hebrew. But then when you look in Greek, it's another page. So it's 4 pages that I'm trying to condense into these, 3 or 4 definitions, which is why I always encourage you to go and read it, research it, learn it for yourself. And then when you understand what that means, come and view the next video so that we can talk about the effects of sin, because that's something totally different. And that's why I'm gonna leave it at. So, like I said, go and do it, research it for yourself, but come meet me back here for the next episode where we talk about the impact that sin has on people and why, again, the world is the way that it is. But like I always say, if you never watch another video, if you never hear anything else that I ever say, just please, please, please remember this. First, just don't let sin hold you back from experiencing life, because the purpose of life is to live. And what better way to live than like royalty? Peace.